Sir, send the link. You can mute it that YouTube, otherwise that sound will come.
Greetings to everyone attending this program. I'm Manjulika from the Division of Health and Humanities, St. John's Research Institute, and I'm happy to be your host for the 7th public lecture in memory of our dear Professor Prakash Shetty. We are privileged to have from across the world Dr. Nandini Shetty joining us online, various members of the Prakash Shetty family here in the hall as well as online, Dr. Prakash Shetty's students, his colleagues, friends, and the executives, staff, and students of St. John's. I call upon our director, Reverend Father Jesudas, to welcome the gathering.
Dear our guest of honor and speaker of the day, Srimati Uma Mahadevan, Additional Chief Secretary, Government of Karnataka, and respected the family members of Dr. Prakash Shetty, especially Dr. Nandini Shetty, and esteemed heads of the institutions and members of executive committee and heads of the departments, former faculty of St. John's, colleagues, friends, and members of St. John's family. It gives me great joy and pleasure to welcome you all to this 7th Professor Prakash Shetty's public lecture. This annual lecture is not only an occasion to reflect on pressing issues in health and society, but also a way of honoring a man who was both a distinguished scholar and a deeply humane person, Professor Prakash Shetty. Professor Shetty began his studies in CMC, but he started his career at St. John's in the Department of Physiology. His intellectual brilliance and dedication soon marked him out as someone distinguished of great impact. Later, his journey took him to London, where he continued to shine as one of the most respected nutritionists of his generation. He was responsible for the considerable achievements of developing the very first whole body calorie meter in Asia with the support from the Wellcome Trust in UK. This was a pioneering step in nutritional science that advanced the understanding of human energy requirements and influenced global policy. But his brilliance was not confined to nutrition alone. Professor Shetty had very wide intellectual interest. He read many thoughts and deep inspiration for beyond boundaries of nutrition of science. He was a man of curiosity, imagination, and vision, qualities that made him not just a scientist, but also a thinker who cared about the broader version of human condition. Although much of his professional life was spent outside of India, his heart remained close to his homeland. He constantly looked for ways to give back, to contribute, to uplift the society from which he had come. His life was guided by gratitude for what he had received and for what he could share in return. We at St. John's National Academy of Sciences are proud that his journey began here. St. John's stands for the values of integrity, compassion, and excellence, offering quality healthcare and education inspired by the conviction that even the least deserves the best. Professor Shetty's life and work resonate deeply with this mission that knowledge and science must ultimately serve humanity, especially the most vulnerable. As we gather, dear friends, for this seventh public lecture, we honor not only his remarkable scientific achievements, but also his legacy as a teacher, mentor, colleague, and above all, a man of integrity and generosity. It is my privilege now to extend a warm welcome to the guest of honor and today's distinguished speaker, Srimati Uma Mahadevan, whose own life of public service and leadership reflects the very values that Professor Shetty cherished. A warm welcome also to Dr. Nandini Shetty and online, to the family of Professor Shetty, to his colleagues and friends, and to all members of St. John's family. May this lecture inspire us, as Professor Shetty's life always did, to pursue knowledge not only for ourselves alone, but in service of others. And advance happy Teachers' Day wishes. All the best. God bless and have a pleasant day. Welcome to St. John's.
Thank you, Father, very much for that warm welcome and for reminding us and reinforcing the values that St. John stands for, as well as the values that Dr. Prakash Shetty stood for. So you have already introduced to us quite a bit of the work that Professor Prakash Shetty did. So I won't repeat that, but just to say that he had a wide range of interests outside academia, including in the history of medicine, in literature, and the arts. And he kept in touch with St. John's till the very end. Dr. Shetty envisaged this public lecture with discussions over the years with Professor Mario Vaz, the then head of the Division of Health and Humanities. The lecture was brought to fruition through the efforts of his wife, Dr. Nandini Shetty, and his family. The lecture was to be on a topic that could speak to people from all walks of life, an area of science which affects public life, or the intersection of science and the arts. In keeping with this idea, the lectures in the past have dealt with a range of issues, delivered by people embedded in their fields. Today, in continuance with that aim, we are privileged to have Srimati Uma Mahadevan speak to us. She is passionate about literature and the humanities, and with her on-the-ground experiences of delivering government services to the public, she is rightly suited to connect public health with humanities and society. The lecture will be followed by a Q&A session, and for those of you joining online, please use the chat box. We now have the opportunity to learn about Prakash Shetty from another angle. We have with us Dr. Sylvia Kamath, who has been an outstanding professor of anatomy and has been with St. John's from its very start, the Booth Bangla days at St. Mary's Orphanage. In 1964 is when she began her career here at St. John's, and right up to 1994. She was a former colleague of Dr. Prakash Shetty during his time at St. John's. She herself was a much-loved teacher and mentor to many. I request Dr. Sylvia Kamath to take the stage as she shares her memories of Prakash Shetty. A warm welcome to you, ma'am, and please join me.
honored guests, staff, director, associate director, and all my friends, the students. Professor Prakash Shetty sounds so distant. Sounds so distant for one who was never pompous. I prefer to say Prakash, my friend, philosopher, and guide. I once did him a favor, and he never forgot it. We became friends, and we remained friends throughout our lives till he passed away. I happened to be in London when he passed away. A brilliant mind, he saw possibilities where others saw none. For instance, we all have gone to Patadakal and Aihole and seen the beautiful temples and the sculptures, and we've come back happy. When Prakash went, not only did he look at all this, he photographed and diagnosed that at that time there were patients with different diseases. He brought those pictures back and he blew them up and gave a lecture. And it was so intriguing to see that many of those diseases are present today also in humanity. A brilliant mind, he saw possibilities in everything he saw. And this was one of the possibilities that we all missed, but he saw. He was my go-to man for anything academic. He was always there to help me. Prakash, I have to go and give the guest lecture at the Anatomical Society of India's annual meeting. What do I speak on? Sylvie, he said, there is a book in the library on intercell communication. Why don't you read it? My problem was solved. There are many, many instances of how he has helped me. I sent a paper to the British Journal of Anatomy, and they promptly sent it back saying, we cannot publish it. What nonsense, he said. It's a very good work. So send it back, Sylvie, with a strict letter and put a sting in the tail. I said, Prakash, you'll have to put that sting. So he wrote the letter with me and we sent the paper back. Not only was it published, part of it has been put into Gray's Anatomy. And so I have the delight to know that my name is in Gray's Anatomy. The other thing I wanted to talk about was the way Prakash had of dealing with everyone. Let it be his colleagues, let it be students, let it be the lower staff, let it be the sweepers. They were all equal to him. And he would have an equal way of dealing with everyone. He never raised his voice. He was always soft and kind and accepting of people as they were. But he had 2 research fellows in his department, and they were always quarreling. I get a call from Prakash, Sylvie, I'm sending these 2 to you. I just can't manage these women's quarrels. So promptly they came to me. God took him away far too soon. And for all of us who came in contact with him and who were very close with him. We feel it, not anyone who came in contact with him, and me too. We miss him a lot. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Sylvia Kamath. Please wait on. We want to felicitate you. That was a beautiful sharing of memories. I think we have to admire her poise, her charm, her wit, her memory at the age of 90. So please give her another hand. And I request our Dean, Dr. Joy, to felicitate her with a shawl, which is embroidered with the St. John's emblem.
This is one of my students.
Big hand, big round of applause. I also would like to thank her son, Rohan, for accompanying Dr. Sylvia Kamath here today. Big hand for him as well. I now have the honor to introduce our speaker, Srimati Uma Mahadevan. I would also like to thank Dr. Nandini Shetty, Dr. Nandini Vallath, and Sandhya Srinivasan and Professor Sunil Pandya for connecting me and our division with her. You can see from what is up on the screen the distinguished career and contributions made by Srimati Uma Mahadevan. She has also introduced a digital platform for participatory planning in Gram Panchayats called Panchatantra 2.0 that promotes inclusion and accountability. But for me, what makes her a civil servant with a difference is her passion and flair for literature, both reading and writing, her passion for inclusion, and above all, to convert intent to action. She has been reviving and opening rural public libraries, helping women's groups, Anganwadi workers in local management. At our recent conference on ethics education, she quoted Tagore and said, "I acted and I felt joy." Ladies and gentlemen, that is Uma Mahadevan for you, a public servant who will deliver this year's public lecture titled Public Health, Humanities and Society. Thank you, ma'am. The stage is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Manjulika, for that lovely introduction. Dr. Nandini Shetty, Reverend Jesudas Rajamanikam, Dr. Sylvia Kamath, Dr. Manjulika Vaz, Dr. George, Father Menzies, Dr. Tony Raj, others distinguished participants in person and online. It's such a great honor to be delivering the 7th Dr. Prakash Shetty Public Lecture 2025. Dr. Prakash Shetty was a highly distinguished professor at St. John's Medical College. During his later years working in the UK and Italy, he continued to maintain strong links with India, remained an emeritus professor at St. John's. I was reading this very beautiful obituary by his colleagues, Paul Trehan and Philip James, in which they write about how, born in India in 1943, before Indian independence, Dr. Shetty trained in medicine at CMC Vellore, joined St. John's, went to Cambridge for a PhD, returning to India, worked at St. John's for many years, did amazing things, and then, of course, moved to London, FAO. He was CEO of the Lancer Consortium, and so on. But what really struck me about the obituary, which was very thoughtfully written, is that it describes, as Dr. Sylvia Kamath so movingly expressed, it describes Dr. Shetty as having a very wide range of interests as an individual for whom the world had no real boundaries. Nevertheless, always recognized that philosophically he was very strongly, and this is what the writers of the obituary say, strongly and very deeply rooted in his background and upbringing in India. He was also very clearly passionate about engaging the arts and humanities with the sciences. And this public lecture, named after him, clearly reflects that passion. Keeping this in mind, I'd like to share some of my reflections on the humanities, public health, and public service in general, because the intersection of academics, arts, activism, and service is really what drew me into public service too. And Dr. Manjulika did mention the quote that I always think of as something that compelled me into public service, where Tagore says, I don't have it in a slide, but he does say, I slept and dreamt that life was joy. I woke and found that life was service. I acted and found that service was joy. And I think that's a very beautiful quote. It's a very deep philosophical quote, which tells us all about the importance of action. Until we actually act, it's a lot of talk and a lot of faffing. But action is deeply meaningful. And that's why I've always been interested in public health, which also brings together the strands of science, art, activism, all the things that make life meaningful, and also bring together the efforts of society as a community. Public health considers the principles of, this is the slide I'd like to start with. I'll come to it. It also considers the principles of social justice and equity, promoting dignified lives for all, leaving no one behind. At its very heart, a focus on reducing inequalities in health, including those driven by racism, discrimination, poverty, and indeed any factor that leads to fracturing and excluding those who are our fellow citizens in society. Public health is a shared responsibility requiring our collective action, not only by the specialist public health workforce. I'm not Dr. Uma Mahadevan, by the way. I'm just Uma Mahadevan. I'm a civil servant. But also the coordinated efforts of governments, civil society organizations, community leaders, and the private sector. Public health work extends beyond the medical into social determinants, including nutrition, safe housing, addressing climate change, including rising heat and its impact on livelihoods. Even as we speak, just this morning I was replying to an email from a researcher, Jane Hurst, who wants to work with us on how rising heat is going to affect maternal health in North Karnataka. Addressing climate change, responding to extreme weather events and disasters. The shared aim of all this work is actually to offer people the best opportunity to live long and productive lives in which they can fulfill their potential with dignity. We had a recent example of an unprecedented public health challenge during the COVID-19 pandemic. The pandemic told us many things. It highlighted ethical conflicts that arise when resources are scarce, when quick decisions must be made to protect the many at the expense of some. But ethical public health policy requires us to continually reflect on how best we can balance benefits, risks, and protect the most vulnerable of our communities. A deeper look shows that public health beyond vaccination programs, sanitation, nutrition, epidemic control is really about people and how they live together and in a society. And this is where it intersects and cannot be separated from the humanities, because health is not just biological, it's also social, cultural, ethical, and deeply human. And this is where the humanities, history, literature, philosophy, the arts from the ancient times, such as the writing of Thucydides or the epics, remind us, among other things, that societies have always faced challenges. One of the first things I thought of when we first started hearing about the COVID pandemic was actually Camus' The Plague, because that's exactly, both literally and metaphorically, about the kind of diseases that take over our communities. And I'll come to this. So a novel, and what literature and art captured, even during the Black Death in medieval Europe, was not only the suffering, but also the responses of communities. These works remind us not only that epidemics are medical crises, but also profound human experiences. And that's where the arts and literature, beyond the merely literal, use metaphor and imagery to take our understanding of these human experiences to a deeper level, to the universal and to wisdom. A novel like Camus' The Plague, to which many commentators, including myself, turned in order to understand the moral and human dimensions of the COVID pandemic, highlights the social and ethical dimensions of disease, quarantine, isolation, the tension between individual freedom, collective responsibility, but it also tells us something deeper about the human heart. And this is where one of the most beautiful quotations from The Plague, this is what I wanted to start with, that more fellowship with the defeated than with the saints. Heroism and sanctity don't really appeal to me, I imagine. What interests me is being a man. Of course, he says a man, I'd say human. But this is one of the most powerful quotations about what actually makes us human. And I think the pandemic, the memories are still with us. I think many of us, both as individuals and as communities or as a society, we haven't really processed the full impact of what COVID did to us, and that processing still remains to happen. I have one more quotation from The Plague. I'll read it out. Dr. Rieu resolved to compile this chronicle. He talks about why he writes it, so that he should not be one of those who hold their peace, but should bear witness in favor of those plague-stricken people, so that some memorial of the injustice and outrage done them might endure. And to state quite simply, what we learn in times of pestilence, that there are more things to admire in men than to despise. That's quite a surprise coming at the end of that paragraph, right? It's deeply optimistic. The emphasis is mine. Profoundly optimistic. And of course, we should also recall that it was Camus who says one of the most beautiful things in literature, which is that in the depth of winter, I found within myself an invincible summer. It's one of my favorite quotes from literature, one of my favorite learnings, a sentence that stays with me. I'd like to show a few pictures from what Karnataka did and what experience we had during the COVID pandemic. I was handling the response in rural Karnataka. I was also handling the connect with civil society organizations and the private sector and so on. And one of the things we found was a tremendous, huge challenges, of course, in rural Karnataka, but also, again, more things to admire than to despise. So one of the first things we did, and I still remember, this was in March 2020, just when the WHO bulletins were coming in, the lockdown had started, we couldn't send people to the rural areas because it was already locked down. So we were wondering what to do. And I still remember an 11 or 12-page circular that we issued saying that we'll set up these Gram Panchayat task forces. Gram Panchayats are local elected bodies. We have nearly 6,000 of them in Karnataka, in rural areas, each one catering to a population of somewhere between 5,000 to 7,000. And they are elected, 50% of them are women. There are nearly 90,000 odd elected representatives. But along with them in these task forces, we created task forces which included, chaired by the Panchayat president, but also included the officials, included the frontline community workers, the Ashas, the Anganwadi workers, included the village rehabilitation workers, sometimes the bank manager, if there was a bank branch there. And here is an example of what they did. They immediately swung into action. I still remember, I think it was March 22nd or 23rd, when we sent out a message on the WhatsApp groups that we will do a training for you because we can't do in-person trainings. We will try to do a training for you on YouTube Live. Please sit in front of your computers by 11 o'clock and sign in on the live chat. The next morning, this was on the 22nd afternoon when we sent out this message, and we booked a studio of the higher education department, and we said we planned out the PPT and all of that. Put together some information from what WHO sent, from something from the Ministry of Health, something that we had. And I remember 10:45, we started seeing these messages trickling in. It was like almost live on the YouTube live chat. They were already sitting in front of their computers. And that's when I knew that something had clicked. And this actually might work. So this is an example of a Gram Panchayat task force. We had task forces like this across the state, nearly 6,000 panchayats. Some of them took actions way beyond what we told them. We had a simple little PPT showing what the coronavirus looked like. At that time, not much was known, what kind of things they needed to do, how they needed to mask, how they need to follow social precautions. But these task forces, in some places, they shifted the entire office into the open and sat under the trees because they knew instinctively that it wasn't very safe to sit inside rooms. So this is how local action can actually change global outcomes. Here's an example. I will talk a little bit about how arts and the humanities. Here's an example of a coronavirus rangoli in one of the panchayats. They actually took the PPT, which we shared, which was a very scientific PPT, and they just converted it into this, slightly intimidating alien-like monster. And here's another one in a tiny panchayat in Dakshina Kannada. It was amazing. They came up with amazing creative solutions. They used chalk and then they used paint to create circles outside the milk cooperative, because village life has to go on. Just like life in our gated communities went on. Life has to go on. The cow needs to be milked. The milk needs to be supplied. People need to work in the MG Narega fields. And all of that had to happen with protection, with physical distancing. And so this is what they did. There were places called kattes under the trees where senior citizens would gather. So they didn't want senior citizens being particularly vulnerable. So what they did was they painted those kattes with sticky oil so that people wouldn't sit there. It was amazing, moving, and it was also very, very humbling, because what they were doing was taking the information, the small bits of information that we were able to give them, and converting it into science-based awareness that was actually going to reduce what could have potentially created huge amounts of stigma, fear, panic. Because remember, the lockdown started just during Ugadi, when a lot of people from urban Karnataka had gone home. And there were people, they were going to jump into the water bodies and swim and do all kinds of things, and potentially, risk infection. So this was one of the things that made us very happy and deeply, humbled by their response. Panchayat members, Asha workers, Anganwadi workers went house to house across Karnataka to collect information about vulnerabilities, comorbidities. Is there a pregnant person? Is there a pregnant woman in the house? Is there somebody who's a stroke victim? Is there somebody who's undergoing treatment for cancer? Are there people who have HIV medications due to them? This was amazing. Here's one of those pictures. We were working out of WhatsApp during that time, and we got thousands and thousands of such pictures showing us the kind of work that local elected representatives and local officials were doing with their communities. Vaccination. This is my last picture in this stretch. COVID vaccination was another exciting project. It was not trivial. It was both simple and also something that needed to be planned, because it needed a phone, it needed registration. Each phone number could be used only for 5 registrations. It needed, initially we did not have, this is actually frontline community workers, literally in the field, vaccinating people. People who are working in MG Narega and various other kinds of, this is I think from Mandya, rice transplantation, paddy transplantation. But initially, it was not happening in the field. People actually needed to be bussed to the PHCs. And that, again, was an area where panchayats started setting up help desks, getting senior citizens together, persons with disabilities, organizing buses, getting them registered, taking them to the PHC, getting them vaccinated. Not only that, there were senior citizens who felt afraid, nervous to take the vaccination. Adults, many people don't remember. As babies, they've had their immunizations. They don't know what's happening. The doctor, they just whisked into the doctor and somebody injects them and so on. But here, Anganwadi workers, Asha workers held the hands of people to calm them down. Well, it was profoundly moving. I have visited places where vaccinations were happening, and there were Anganwadi workers sitting there and counseling people and saying, don't worry, nothing will happen. We'll take the injection. We've taken it. And there were Gram Panchayat members saying that we will take the injection first so that the others can feel confident. So it was extremely moving. So those were moments from the COVID pandemic. But again, to return to Camus, such cultural narratives help us to see beyond statistics and understand the emotional, psychological, and moral weight of public health decisions as communities. I also hark back to the words of Martin Luther King, who said that of all the forms of inequality, injustice in healthcare is the most shocking and inhumane. Public health is therefore not just about curing illnesses, it's also about building environments where people are empowered to seek access to clean water, education, social support, and also life with dignity. It's the humanities that remind us that issues like stigma, inequality, discrimination are as important and need to be addressed. A few examples. I've already shown you the importance of the plague as a novel, not only about disease in the medical sense, but also about corruption in a moral and ethical sense. But also we know from the HIV and AIDS response over the decades that arts and visual culture play a tremendous role in public health. The photographic narratives of people living with HIV around the globe reduced stigma through empathy on a personal and community level, oral histories, community narratives, literature from the AIDS crisis, not only fiction, but memoirs, poetry, plays, and essays give a voice to those suffering stigma and loss, not only the patients, but families, caregivers, and communities, raising awareness and urging and fostering policy action. The anthropologist Paul Farmer's work, which I'm sure all of you are familiar with, in Haiti, found that health interventions are most successful when they respect and incorporate local beliefs, and this inclusive approach leads to better outcomes and greater health equity. In short, public health, humanities, and society are deeply connected and intersect at levels both individual and levels that are also deeply philosophical. Science gives us the tools, but the humanities give us important perspective, empathy, and a direction towards wisdom. Together, they help us to see that health is not simply the absence of disease, but also about how societies recognize the dignity of every individual, care for those who are vulnerable, and strive for justice and well-being. I often say to my team members that what we learned from the Gram Panchayats, the self-help group women, and farmers during the COVID pandemic in rural Karnataka was actually that you can move from a paradigm of welfare. In welfare, in the paradigm of welfare, you expect persons needing care, needing help to come to you. But you can move from a paradigm of welfare to one of care. You can actually move from the metaphor, and I will talk about it, of the last mile, which comes from telecommunications. In public service delivery, we often talk about the last mile, but I've started understanding over the last few years that we need to talk about the first mile, because it's at the first mile, at the local level, at the community level, that you can regard every person in their context with their dignity and their needs. The humanities are what offer us these essential perspectives and skills to help us to become compassionate, culturally aware, and ethical members of society. I don't often quote Churchill because I disagree with some of his racist and bigoted beliefs, but I am told that once when he was asked about cutting funding to the arts in order to fund the war effort, he actually asked back, if we do that, what are we actually fighting for? And I think that understanding about the importance of the arts, it's at a visceral level, it's most important for human existence. I'd like to talk a little bit now about the role of public servants in society. I've spoken about public health, I've spoken a little bit about humanities, but from my own lens as a public servant, I'd like to talk about, it's something that troubles me a lot, about deteriorating principles, and I'd like to talk a little bit about it. Even after several decades, welfare programs in India often fall short of their intended outcomes. We have continued and intractable problems such as child stunting. Here is a picture of children, Anganwadi children, on a field trip. I think Dr. Kurpad, you may have seen it in one of my Anganwadi presents. It's a favorite of mine. It's a group of Anganwadi children. Child stunting remains intractable, 35%. The lack of attention to girls' education. This is one of the pictures from the libraries. We don't pay enough attention to girls, their needs, their educational needs, their needs for nutrition. Underage marriage. This is a picture from a children's Gram Sabha, a children's assembly in rural Bellary, where the young girl who's, these pictures are all taken with consent, by the way, the young girl who's standing up and talking is expressing her fear that her family is going to get her married. She's 15 years old and her family is pressurizing her to get her married. Of course, our team, local team, immediately took action, spoke to the family, got it prevented, continued her education and so on. But what I found interesting was that she found this children's assembly, this large gathering, enough of a safe space to actually stand up and share this deeply troubling fear of hers. And the need, the need for policy to understand that deprivation is intersectional and needs to be addressed as such. This is a child who's visually impaired, sitting in one of our libraries, in a remote library, rural library in Ramnagara district on the banks of the Kaveri, and she's listening to a story on the computer because the computer has made it possible for her to access learning resources close to her home. It's as simple as that. We can have decentralized learning centers, learning hubs, if we recognize and prioritize that deprivation is intersectional, and we must take everybody along and ensure that no one is left behind. Some policy commentators have blamed this failure to achieve outcomes partly on what is called algorithmic thinking in the bureaucracy, and partly on the tendency to turn to technology to solve social problems. I've done a bit of work, and I'm glad you mentioned Panchatantra too. I've done a bit of work on using technology to solve social problems. I think there's tremendous hope and tremendous potential for technology to do things in inclusive ways. And that really gives me hope. Other commentators say there has been a moral failure of the civil service due to a flawed system of incentives and penalties. But for a different view, it's important to look at the nature of algorithmic thinking. Firstly, this mindset has nothing to do with STEM education, whether it's engineering or the arts. Unfortunately, many degrees in the present-day education system tend to be more about a credential and proof of test-taking ability rather than a guarantee of any particular kind of learning. Having said this, what we call the algorithmic mindset exists. It's found not just in pockets of any particular segment, but in all sections of society. It's found both among STEM and non-STEM graduates. It's quite different from scientific thinking. Scientific thinking, and you're all practitioners here, observes empirical evidence, questions assumptions, draws inferences, skeptical, instead of rushing to conclusions. In contrast, what we refer to for lack of a better word, as the algorithmic mindset, is something that's non-reflexive. It reduces complex social problems to a set of simple inputs and outputs. This kind of thinking is a problem. This algorithmic mindset starts not in college, but in school. It's the inevitable result of a rote-based education system that doesn't let students ask questions or reflect independently or inquire into real-life social processes or think of consequences. Students are not expected to take risks, explore nuances, or navigate through ambiguities. They are only told to read, memorize, and regurgitate what is served up to them in discrete nuggets. They learn to see the world in black and white. As for technology, as I said, when thoughtfully designed, it's a powerful tool to address many challenges in governance. It can limit discretion and bias. It can increase transparency. It can reduce inclusion errors. Yet, it may be of limited use in addressing the more serious moral problem of exclusion. I refer to the migrant woman worker at the brick kiln, the bedridden child with multiple disabilities, the destitute elderly person in an unnotified slum, the teenage girl married at 15 and pregnant at 16, who may not even receive antenatal care because, according to the regulations, her documents don't even reflect in the system. If these persons are sometimes invisible to our welfare system, it's due to gaps in policy design. Welfare programs fail when we do not have sufficiently granular knowledge about people and when we fail to see every person as an individual with agency. In valorizing technology as a panacea, we ignore its tendency to aggregate and centralize. Simultaneously, we have ignored the potential of decentralization. Decentralization is viewed with doubt by many civil servants who prefer command and control. But to me, it's the real way to regard the individual person and reach them where they are. As I said, to adapt a metaphor from telecommunications, decentralization is in fact the first mile for service delivery rather than the last, because it is the level at which citizens and local governments are within arm's length of each other. Finally, in my reflections, I felt that the civil service reflects the values and beliefs of society. During heavy floods in one of India's largest cities, a city resident wrote on social media to the municipal corporation about a clogged manhole. Within hours, the social media team of the municipal corporation responded with the picture of a man unclogging it with his bare hands. The blockage was removed, but the inhuman practice of essential workers having to work with bare hands and without safety and without dignity has not ended. As a society, we have to reflect on the choices we make. It's true that there are no simple solutions to oppressive social structures, and yet we cannot just turn away from the difficult problems, addressing only the superficial ones, or what we call the low-hanging fruit. What kind of incentive can be the primary motivation for public service? Surely, nothing more meaningful than the work itself. The chief executive of an investment bank was once trolled for the specious remark that banks are doing God's work. Cynicism aside, public service has an undeniable social and societal purpose. What could be the way forward? One important answer, I think, is in training. In the field, trainee civil servants are often assigned to a laundry list of attachments in different departmental offices. This can distance them from people and their everyday struggles. As the years pass, the distance grows. From this distance, the poor can start to look like beneficiaries rather than as equals, fellow citizens, and partners in building the nation. At this point, I'd like to talk a little bit about how we need to really hold conversations with the young. I read a recent news report about a young civil servant caught taking a bribe. It made me feel cynical. Not just the act itself, but how early it had occurred seemed awful, as if corruption is a lifestyle disease, like diabetes almost, bound to set in eventually. It started making me wonder how we can resist this drift and how we can prevent public life from corroding the ideals of the young. I'm often invited to talk to young people, and whenever possible, I accept, both as a parent, as a public servant, and as the daughter of someone who was a school teacher. I know how much these conversations matter. The young are full of creative energy. They're honest, they're fearless, and not afraid to show vulnerability. They have a hunger to learn, and they give me hope. At the National Academy in Missouri, our director introduced our cohort of young trainees to Gandhi's talisman. He said, recall the face of the poorest and the weakest person you may have seen, and ask yourself if the step you contemplate is going to be of any use to them. Will they gain anything by it? Will it restore them to control over their own life and destiny? I think that last question is most important. It's about agency. It's about dignity. The drawing, that very beautiful drawing, is by Akbar Padamsi, by the way. So this quotation from Gandhi, this Gandhi's talisman, was a reminder that public service is not charity or noblesse oblige, but it's about dignity and agency and justice. Today, as a mother, I worry about the challenges before my son's generation: climate change, conflict, growing inequality, precarious livelihoods, malnutrition, poor education, gender-based violence, oppressive social structures. The list is long and heavy. Every day, the world tells us to live for ourselves. The fear of missing out, apparently, is a thing, and young people talk about it. But I think our common future depends on recognizing, as the poet John Donne said centuries ago, that we are bound together in our destinies. He says, no man is an island entire of itself. Every man is a piece of the continent. Any man's death diminishes me, because I'm involved in mankind, and therefore never sent to know for whom the bell tolls, it tolls for thee. This truth became starkly clear to all of us during the COVID pandemic. Those of us who worked from home could do so only because of essential workers, healthcare staff, farmers, delivery personnel, sanitation workers, and more, who kept society going. In an interconnected world, everybody's life is built on the invisible work of others. What we are today is also because of those before us. If we're free, it's because others struggled for freedom. If we can read and write, it's because of those who built schools. In turn, we must do what we can for future generations. In Rabindranath Tagore's wise words, those who plant trees knowing that they'll never sit in their shade have at least started to understand the meaning of life. The anthropologist Margaret Mead, I had mentioned this during my previous talk, was once asked about the first sign of human civilization. A healed human femur, she replied. In ancient times, an injured person would be left behind to die. But a healed femur meant that someone had stayed back to stay with them and care for them and feed them until their femur healed and they were able to forage for themselves. The story may be apocryphal, but its meaning is clear. Human civilization is built on care and cooperation. And I wanted to remind us all of another beautiful quotation from Margaret Mead, that it's only a small group. Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. Art and literature have always known this. After all, it was Leo Tolstoy who expressed it simply. If you feel pain, you're alive. If you feel another person's pain, you're a human being. Civil servants have an ethics paper. Many courses have ethics papers. An ethics paper may not be enough to teach integrity. We live in an age where young people are taught how to crack exams rather than to learn. Public institutions ultimately reflect societal values. But there are 5 concrete steps that occurred to me that might help build foundational values in the young. First, we have to teach the children well. It was Aristotle who said that educating the mind without educating the heart is no education at all. We have to teach children to strive for excellence, but also to let them learn to accept and forgive themselves. When they fail, they can try again. The most important life lessons, including social and emotional learning, are learned in the early years. Warm and secure childhoods produce well-adjusted adults. Second it's time to teach students the Constitution deeply, in theory and in practice. Civics education is the bedrock of a strong democracy. Third, instead of hothousing young people in coaching classes, it's time for us to let them also work within communities. They will learn to regard others as equals. They will learn to work with people, and not just for them. Fourth, of course, to promote art and literature. As a counter to the self-obsession and instant validation of social media, the arts are what let us sit for a while with the lives and feelings of others. Literature teaches us empathy and expands our imaginative and humane vision. But fifth, and most important, beyond all this, is to model good living, service, and reflective practice. What we say ultimately matters much less than what we do. When we serve, young people will see volunteerism as a natural part of life. Through reflective practice, they learn to pause, introspect, and consider the impact of their actions on the world around. Finally, we should be wary of sanctimoniousness. Moral arrogance is distasteful. As Nietzsche warned, whoever fights monsters should see to it that in the process, they don't become a monster. In a world full of chatter, panels, hashtags, schmoozing, action is fundamental. Action should be quiet, consistent, and as I said, local. The point is not to split hairs endlessly, but to actually make a difference on the ground. There are 2 billion young people in the world. We should prepare them to face the future with integrity and courage. Finally, there's a personal story I'd like to share. Do I have a few minutes? Yeah. There's a personal story I'd like to share on the essential human need for stories themselves and for narrative. When I joined the civil service in 1992, the literacy campaigns were being taken up all over the state to help people who had never had a chance to learn to read and write. While I was working in the field, this was in Mysore, in the area of HD Kote, tribal area, and Kollegal, a senior literacy activist from Delhi once told me about how the great Shivram Karanth wrote a set of stories in the 1950s to help illiterate adults learn to read. It was for a UNESCO project in Mysore. Whether for children or for adults, Karanth said that stories must be interesting if learners are to be engaged. It would be patronizing to ask adult learners to read children's books. At the same time, as beginning readers, they could not straightaway attempt Karanth's novels. Hearing this, Karanth stayed up one entire night to write a set of new stories specifically meant for adult learners. The next morning, the literacy activist who was staying with him found a pile of discarded drafts on the floor, which showed how carefully Karanth had worked on these stories. Decades later, these stories by Karanth, illustrated with beautiful drawings by no less than the artist K.K. Hebbar, became part of the Dakshin Kannada literacy campaign. I used them myself in 1998 when we did another literacy campaign, another round of the literacy campaign across the state. Karanth told the literacy activist that the books should be small in size and easy to hold, and with large print for adult learners who would use them to learn to read. Think of the engagement. Here is a Gyanpith Award-winning writer, an illustrious writer, senior writer, explaining exactly the font size and the layout of the page, like children's picture books, but with deeply philosophical stories to which adults could relate. One of the stories, so these are pictures from my copies of the books. One of the stories in Karanth's primers was a retelling from the tales of the Buddha, the parable of Kisa Gautami and the mustard seed. Kisa Gautami came weeping to the Buddha one day because her son had died. She pleaded to the Buddha to give her some medicine to revive the child. The Buddha asked her to bring him a handful of mustard seeds from a house where there had been no death. Going from house to house, you can see that picture. She's going from house to house. Hige ellara maneyu savu kanda maneye. Going from house to house in search of one where no one had died, Kisa Gautami heard story after story of grief and loss until she realized that death came inevitably to every home. Thus, her grief was calmed. I imagined the learners sitting in a circle in some volunteer's house, exhausted after a day of daily wage physical labor, but with a hunger to learn to read, slowly decoding the words, looking at the illustrations, making meaning out of the sentences, and feeling a deep kinship with the grieving mother at the story's heart. I thought again of the story of Kisa Gautami and the mustard seeds on the day my mother died in a cancer hospital in Mumbai 17 years ago. We had known for days and weeks even that the end was near. My mother had slipped into a coma, and the oncologist told us gently that her organs were shutting down one by one. There are standard phrases for these situations. She is sinking. The end is near. It will soon be over. When we went to the hospital, we hadn't taken enough reading material. I had, in my bag, I always carry a book, so I found a classic Muriel Spark novel, The Crime of Miss Jean Brodie. My husband hadn't carried a book, but he read the whole of an Alice Munro story, short story, on his phone. The next morning, I brought more books because it would be a long haul. And yet, when it came, what they call the end, I was unprepared. The death rituals gave us things to do and matters to arrange while our minds were elsewhere. Earthen pots were procured, flower garlands, a bowl of rice grains, some coins. In the morning, my mother's body was sent into the furnace at the electric crematorium at Chandanwadi. That evening, we poured the still warm pot of ashes into the sea at Breach Candy. No food was cooked in the house. A neighbor sent idlis, someone sent parathas. A small mud lamp flickered in a corner all night and all day. On the 10th day, a young priest who worked night shifts as a BPO staffer texted on his phone while chanting the shlokas. We arranged rice balls and unsalted food on a banana leaf and waited for the crows in order to, the priest said, turn my mother's drifting soul away from earth and towards heaven. As I imagined my mother's winged soul flying further and further away, I felt a mother-shaped hole open up in my heart. Would I ever see my mother again? Her tired smile, her quizzical look? Would she ever joke about Bertie Wooster stories with my husband again? Would I be able to talk to her saying, I knew you would say that, the way we did? Would I ever be her daughter and she my mother again? It occurred to me that we all need our parables of the mustard seed. And that is what the arts and the humanities do for us. I thought again of the story of Kisa Gautami when I read Amitav Kumar's moving essay Paya about his mother's death in Patna. The image that accompanies the memoir in Granta is one of marigolds, a broken garlands, some petals floating on water. I felt my stomach lurch when I saw this image because I remembered how we poured my mother's ashes, including pieces of bone, into the water, along with thick fistfuls of marigold petals. Because it isn't when the doctor is signing a death certificate or when your mother's body goes into the fire, but only when you have poured the ashes into the water and tossed all the flowers into it and your hands are finally empty. It's only then that you begin to comprehend the loss. Your mother is no longer on this earth. I dealt with my sorrow by writing in my notebook, says Kumar. There's a very long tradition of writers writing about mortality. Faced with the end, a writer reflects upon the life that preceded it. Joan Didion writes, in The Year of Magical Thinking, about her husband's death and her daughter's illness. Cheryl Strayed writes about the loss of her mother and her subsequent journey of self-discovery in Wild. Dr. Paul Kalanidhi writes a memoir about his own mortality in When Breath Becomes Air. And most recently, I read Jenny Diskey's Cancer Posts. Each one's treatment of the subject is vastly different. Didion's prose is filled with taut clarity. Strade's narrative is spirited, adventurous, and wild. Kalanidhi's is the measured, precise account of a medical professional. There is no syrupy self-help, no cliché, no false promises in these memoirs. The writers are at their most thoughtful, but also unguarded and honest as they come up against the final mystery of death. In his essay, Amitav Kumar also reflects on another story, A.K. Ramanujan's Annaya's Anthropology. A young Indian graduate student at the University of Chicago, sitting in a library, engrossed in a book by an American anthropologist, sees a picture of a funeral ritual. As he turns the pages and begins to read, on closer inspection, he discovers that it is, in fact, his father's body which is on the pyre. He realizes that his father is dead. Apart from Ramanujan's profoundly ironical point about Indian self-discovery in Western knowledge, Kumar adds, the story tugs at the immigrant's dread that distance will prevent this fulfillment of filial duty. Not to mention the distance that lies beyond. Death is an individual grief. For others, it may have only academic interest. I had been luckier than Annaya, reflects Kumar, but there's sadness in his words. The humanities teach us to draw meaning from experiences that are both universal and individual and universal. The arts teach us what is worth living for and what is worth fighting for. In short, the humanities teach us what it means to be human. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much. Thank you very, very much. I was going to say Dr. Srimati Uma Mahadevan. Please do sit down. I think you need a break. It was not just informative, it was stirring. I think that's what has happened. It was bringing together philosophy, science, and really the heart. Your line about connecting the mind and art is really through the heart. So thank you so much for that. Please join me again in giving her a big hand. We now have some time for questions. So this is not an oration, but a lecture. So we are open for questions. Do put on the mic in front of you, and Dr. Mahadevan, Uma Mahadevan will address the question. Those online also can add their questions. Dr. Nandini.
No, I think Mrs. Nandini Shetty has posted a comment, if you could read it.
Nandini, you can also unmute and share your thoughts. So Nandini has said, thank you, Uma Mahadevan, for an erudite lecture that has combined so successfully the principles of public health with innovative and practical measures to serve the needs of the people. I appreciate your emphasis on rural communities and the very important role of women and girls within these communities. You are an inspiration and a role model for strong women leaders everywhere. Thank you again from Nandini.
Thank you so much, Dr. Nandini.
We'll just put the mic on in front of you. You know how this works. And then Sudhir, yeah. Technology and
Oh, it works. Isn't that a press RN? Thank you, Uma. That was a superb lecture. And I just wanted to thank you for reminding us that, the WHO, how it defines health as not merely an absence of disease, but actually well-being and so on. But you brought to the fore that dignity and agency are very important parts of it, which I think the WHO will do well to add to its definition of good health. So thank you for that. I just want to also remind the audience that I've had the honor and pleasure of working with Uma, and I just wish there were more people in the bureaucracy like you. Thank you for what you do.
Thank you. Thank you so much for those kind words.
Exceptional lecture. I actually have heard you twice this week because I was also there for the Institute of Public Health 20th. I have a question for you, and that's my question is about the non-allopathic forms of medicine. the Ayush space. How do you integrate that from a policy, education, service perspective as we go further in a post-COVID world in this country?
Thank you. Thank you for that. And that's a very, very important and thoughtful question. I think what we have found is that the non-allopathic forms of medicine are going to be increasingly important, but we're still finding our way around. The Indian systems of medicine have already been part of our health systems in Karnataka and in other states. But how we need to integrate them beyond the purely functional, having these doctors here and those in the PHCs and functioning, performing as primary health doctors, that is something that we're still finding our way through. And any suggestions on that, happy to have a conversation later.
Yeah, Raghu, go ahead.
Great talk. I wanted to ask you about a very difficult problem that we saw during the COVID pandemic, and that is the issue of balancing personal freedom versus public good. This was evident in many different ways. One was the desire or otherwise to follow lockdowns, isolation, distancing, and also the acceptance or otherwise of vaccines. Now, there are, of course, scientific solutions and answers that one can give. But as a public servant, how do you deal with this issue of individual freedom versus overall public good?
Yeah, thank you for that. Again, a very, very thoughtful question. I think, COVID taught us many things, and there were certain things that across the world could have been done better. But hindsight is always 20/20. And so what is important for us, for example, could we have done school and college closures differently? Could we have had different ways? In fact, the revival of the rural libraries started as a response to the fact that schools and colleges were closed and there was an anxiety among rural communities. So I think it's important to really have honest conversations across the world about processing the lessons of the pandemic. However, there is a challenge there because during the pandemic, and you know that there are constraints on state capacity, not just in India, but in different parts of the world. We were all constantly on our feet. All whole of government was working. So there was this immediate sense, there was a sense of urgency about so much that a lot of the learnings actually could not be perhaps documented as well as we perhaps would have liked to do so, and post-pandemic need to be done. The other thing is, I think it's also led to a lot of anxiety about understanding how we should move forward in pandemic learnings, because having these conversations, there's been a lot of people are still, I think, processing some of the trauma. There were civil servants who were in an ICU with siblings in other ICUs, in other hospitals. A colleague of mine lost both his sister, who was in a government hospital, and his brother, who was in a private hospital, in the middle of the second wave. So yes, I think these conversations are important, but how we have them, whether we can create the spaces for deeper conversations or whether we have moved on to other challenges, is still a question that remains to be answered.
Any youngsters, our students who are part of our Citizen Doctor program, our reflective writing workshops, any questions that you might have? That is Sanjeev. I don't see him as a student, but yeah, you want to add a point? Okay, maybe we'll have the last two questions. Yes, Sanjeev.
So thank you very much for that lecture. Really enjoyed it, but I think I missed a few things. I'm just curious to know whether you covered or would you like to comment on the challenges of policies by government and institutions that I see as a major barrier to directing physician education or physicians or allied care providers, directing their focus on well-being and health as a primary focus. So is there any move? Because I find these policies are the reasons why I don't focus on well-being, health, ecology, or anything like that. Any comment on that?
Well, I think the need for that is definitely recognized. But one of the things we found during the pandemic is that the time it takes for policy to convert into actual programs and schemes and a government order, even if you take, for example, a government order, and you issue a government order, and then it has to percolate to the field level. Just to give you the example in a different context of something about civil society organizations being able to procure food grains at subsidized rates in order to provide food relief to vulnerable communities in need, required a lot of work in translating it into language, both in translating it into different languages, but also translating into simple language, which is not like a government order, which actually makes sense to people on the ground, functionaries as well as to citizens on the ground. So to come back to your question, while the policy recognition of this importance is already there, conversations have to continue on how we actually make that happen in practice. And there are challenges. I'd be happy to discuss this after.
Thank you so much. I think there are many questions, but we'll need to take them over tea in an informal setting because these are complex issues. And I think like what Uma Mahadevan said, they require deeper deliberation and interconnectedness. I mean, we can't just point fingers to the other to make it happen. We need to put all minds together. So I would like to say another thank you to Uma Mahadevan, as well as especially from our Division of Health and Humanities and History of Medicine. Ma'am, you have been the biggest advocate of making the humanities center stage in our medical college. So I do wish we are going to have more collaborations with you and with all who are present in this room. So thank you, ma'am. You've done us a great service and definitely the memory of Professor Prakash Shetty. Thank you so much. I call upon our Associate Director, Father Ajit Menezes, to present our speaker a memento of our gratitude. I'd also like to add a word that ma'am also walks her talk. She has passed on the honorarium that we've offered her to our hospital to help with the costs of medical care. So with that, we come to the end of this 7th memorial lecture. I call upon our Dean of the Research Institute, Dr. Tony, to deliver the vote of thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Manjulika. Our director had to leave for an urgent meeting, so in his absence, we have other executives. Father Ajit is here, Dr. George, and other members of our executive committee. Srimati Uma Mahadevan, thank you so much for being here, for accepting our invitation. And it's a privilege to give this vote of thanks on this unique occasion. On behalf of St. John's, I would like to join the entire family here to thank you for taking time. I know your schedule is extremely busy, but we really appreciate you for being here and taking us through this so eloquent lecture that you were able to weave humanities, public health administration, and society. With those stories that you told us, the pictures you shared, your lecture was very deep, and the quotes of various, philosophers and others. As Manjulika mentioned, your support to the Division of Humanities, which started here several years ago, is here to, stress on compassion, empathy in healthcare. And I think, as Manjulika mentioned, you walk the talk as a public servant, you've managed to take this very deeply and practice it. And we thank you for sharing your thoughts with us. You covered very diverse topics from climate change and health, and also spoke about, moving the paradigm from welfare to care, and the role of public servants in health. And I think for all our members here online as well as within the audience, I think it's so important to identify that there's so much that the government does. There's a human touch to everything that you'll finally do. And we as humans have to recognize that in our care delivery and in our care, in our services. So thank you again. Please join me once again in giving her a big applause for sharing her thoughts with us. I'm sure Professor Prakash Shetty, if he was here, would have been very pleased to see how these lectures are evolving, and the Division of Humanities will continue this legacy. I would especially like to thank Dr. Sylvia Kamath, who accepted our kind invitation and coming here in person. Thank you, ma'am, for coming here and sharing those thoughts which were so precious to you and Professor Shetty in the years that you shared with him. We're really grateful for you to come here in person, and thank you. Thanks, Rohan Kamath, for her son, for bringing her here. Thank you, Rohan. I know you're somewhere in the room. I can't see you, but thank you so much here. I would also like to thank the family members. Dr. Nandini, thank you for constantly being with us and the team and your guidance over these years, and all the family members of Professor Prakash Shetty who supported this lecture and have continued to support us. I would like to thank the management for always facilitating everything that we do here in St. John's. Our director, I thank Father Ajit and Dr. George for facilitating our, speaker, and our, our Dr. Sylvie. Manjulika and your team, the humanities and the history of medicine, have been core to this, and thank you so much for planning this over the months. I'd like to thank the committee of Mario Vaz, Dr. Suarez, and Manjulika for having several behind-the-scene calls and working with everyone to put this together. I also like to thank everyone who's here online. And this is a special lecture of the Academy and the St. John's Research Institute. So thank you for your time here this afternoon. A big thank you to the logistic teams of Ali, Prajit, Maharaj, and Rajan, and everyone who's been handling various logistics behind the scenes. If I've missed anyone, I'm sorry. But to everyone who's been here and online, thank you so much for your time this afternoon. There's tea and coffee being served outside. Manjulika, thank you so much.